people I haven't seen for many years, and some people I see every day all together, some people I haven't met, and look forward to hearing how you knew Jeremy and what he meant to you. And what a shame he couldn't be here today, because he would have absolutely adored this party. So we're going to have a few people speaking briefly, and then a short break, and then a couple more people speaking, and then just carry on with mingling and eating and drinking and sharing memories and having a good time. So thank you, Edward and Virginia and Drusilla and John and Jesse for the food, and everyone who's helped make this happen today, and Anna and Jessica with don't be put off by the photography. Jeremy had a lot of friends and family in England who couldn't be here, who would love to see this, experience it virtually, so we're recording it for their benefit. So we're going to start with Jeremy's dear friend John Daniels, who lived across the road with Kathy for many years, and they shared a friendship based on good music and good wine, I believe. So, John, please.
For Jeremy's 70th, I was unwell and couldn't deliver the speech that I have prepared and amended for today. So, anyway, Jeremy and I had been casual acquaintances for a number of years after our first meeting in late 1985. In 1997, Stephen Kovacevic had played the Diabelli variations in the last Schubert Piano Sonata at the Town Hall. We ran into one another after the concert, and when Jeremy sensed that I was about to launch into a rather ponderous dissertation on the various elements of the performance, he suggested quite kindly that we should have a drink at his place several days later, because, as he said, and the words remain in my memory, we may have much in common, including a distaste for technology. So those several days later, with a bottle of Leakenfield Cabernet under my arm, I walked across the road, knocked on the door, and was taken by Jeremy into his living room for the first time. As we talked, drank some wine and ate some cheese, I looked about me at the fusion of the contemporary, even the quite radical edginess, and the more traditional. There was an ambience of unassuming balance, a balance of art and of everyday life, and it was remarkably intellectual and English, but never forced, never imposed, just organic and natural. We spoke of many things that night, but aptly, Thomas Hardy and the personification of place. And so our friendship began. It was a rare privilege to have been able to talk about so much with Jeremy over the years, about art, music, literature, ancient and modern history, politics, economics, philosophy, and the things about which we were passionate, the things that churned around in our thoughts. It was a rare privilege to have been able to do this with a man who wanted to know things absolutely, who did not take shortcuts, nor make comments where he was not completely informed. There was an enormous amount of reading and thinking behind this, of thoroughness and intellectual purity. Jeremy was generous in every true sense of the word. When he gave, he did so routinely. We always felt his affection for us. He gave because he cared and because he wanted his friends to be able to expand their lives. This is what friends do for one another. Friends change our lives. Jeremy was my friend.
Thank you so much, John. And Anna will just assault you for a brief moment there. Thank you, John. That was very touching, and that as Jeremy showed me that after his 70th birthday, Jeremy said, "Oh, John gave me the speech that he was going to read, but wasn't well enough to give." And I thought, what a beautiful speech. I'm very glad that it finally got air in such sad circumstances, unfortunately. Now, Anne Devison has been a great matriarch of our family, and
I'd like to stand up after that.
is going to share a few thoughts on her long association with dear Jeremy. And I'll just hold this.
And my association with Jeremy began when I think Virginia brought Jeremy round for me to inspect. And I thought Jeremy was terrific. I enjoyed talking to him. I recognised his very Englishness and the fact that he was extremely polite. In fact, he was usually polite, unless a storm got in the way.
That's appropriate.
Very appropriate, yeah. I think he's banging to come inside.
Just be a situation.
And I remember Jeremy in so many different occasions, but I particularly remember his hospitality. I remember often just coming to the front gate, is the gate there or there I think, and Jeremy coming to the door and looking so pleased and saying, "Come in," or I thought he looked pleased, and I'm sure he was, probably was. And he was always saying, "Oh, I've got to fix the roof and this is falling over, but I'm going to do it soon." And there was a kind of an anxiety, but it always got done. But inside there was often some kind of chaos sometimes in the kitchen. Is that fair? Yeah.
Especially when there was fish involved.
Yeah, but there would be terrific meals would emerge from the chaos. And with Jeremy there was also the rigor and the flexibility, the fluency of his scholarship, his love of music, which a lot of which he helped impart to me, and so many other things. He was a man of many different parts. I remember later in his life when he became, I think, very homesick for England. It was probably something he'd felt for a long time, and he struggled against. And I think that was probably possibly a part of the period that he had when he went into deep depression. But what struck me there was actually his bravery then, because he was prepared to take risks or to try things that might help him that many other people wouldn't. And he'd insist on walking back from the hospital here. He'd walk back. And he'd do it with a certain elan, a certain casualness about it. These are part of many, many memories of Jeremy, and ones that I find when I started to think about it and about him, how much he'd given me and how good he'd been as a friend, which was something that John's already talked about. So for me, and I think for everyone here, the fact that so many people have come because of Jeremy is a great tribute to his name and to his friendship.
Thank you, Anne. And Jeremy did have a very special affection for you. He was so fond of you.
Thank you.
And as we all are.
Yeah.
Now, Paul is a great friend of Jeremy's and is going to share some thoughts with us.
Yes, I can't really remember the first time that I met Jeremy. It must have been in Katoomba sometime in the 1990s, probably at the Writers' Centre at Varuna. And we gradually got to know each other. I saw a lot more of him when I was living in Sydney later. We bonded really over classical music and over some byways or pathways of British literature. He, of course, was very keen on Trollope and also on Thomas Hardy, whom he studied at university. I was very much the dabbler in these things, and he was the connoisseur. He introduced me to quite a number of previously unknown to me composers. The Baroque French harpsichordist Jacques Dufly, the Second Viennese School composer Alexander Zemlinsky, the British composer Harrison Birtwistle. and many other things. He also was very fond of Janacek, and in the last years he was working on and off on a dual biography of Janacek and Hardy. A curious, quixotic project, I thought, which he justified by saying it was going to be like Plutarch. Plutarch's biographies have a moral to them, and I never could quite sort out whether Jeremy's moral was going to be that Hardy and Janacek were similar in being people from obscure backgrounds who had to work hard for their success, or whether the link was perhaps the contrast of the volatile Czech with the rather dour Englishman. But in any case, it proceeded. I have a number of completed chapters of it. It seemed to me that Jeremy regarded the contemporary world with some distaste, some lack of enthusiasm at any rate. He retreated to a sort of a time warp, which kind of the limits of which seem to be perhaps the Baroque 17th century up to maybe the high modernism, whenever that dies out, 1980s or something. He did yield to the temptations of a basic mobile phone and a microwave, but he had no truck at all with the internet or computers or let alone smartphones. He stuck, of course, to his Englishness. I don't think I ever heard a broad vowel come out of his mouth. He was also very English in his whimsy, which seemed to be completely uninflected by years of Australian laconic realism. And the pipe paraphernalias. I'm sure most of you know. Long after smoking a pipe ceased to be fashionable, and in fact, it's probably anything but. He clung to that habit. All sorts of ways in which he liked to exist in a time warp. It could have, in another person, I think, made them bitter or a bit of a curmudgeon. But Jeremy was always punctiliously courteous and tolerant. And he visited us in Canberra last May. He and I went to some of the Canberra Music Festival together. And while there, he met Maria's young nephew, 16-year-old Louis, who was intrigued by and beguiled by Jeremy's sonorous voice, and also by the pipes that he'd brought with him. One of my last memories of Jeremy is him methodically explaining to Louis about each of these pipes, explaining about its design, where it came from, how he had bought it, how he used it, etc.
That's what a 16-year-old boy needs. Huh?
That's what. Lots of instruction is needed on pipe smoking by a 16-year-old. So at the end of that, when he returned home from that trip, he wrote me a letter. I don't know anyone else who writes letters these days. So this is probably the last letter I will ever receive. And it seems to me, in its embedded qualifications and tone of amused attachment, to be entirely typical of Jeremy. He says, "The train was admirably punctual, though its schedule was hardly demanding. I had a hot dinner, thanks to microwave, which was quite acceptable in an airline-y sort of way, and was pleasantly surprised by the quality and non-exploitative price of the wine. I very greatly enjoyed my 48 hours in your strange, unreal city. Was glad to leave Sydney and also to return, which I suppose is just as well. Well, he was a discerning man, a just man, and a gentle man, and a good friend, and I'll miss him.
Thank you, Paul. That was beautiful. That extract of Jeremy's letter, I think, is so typical of his easy wordplay. And I've read the first page of his Janacek and Hardy biography, and I'm not sure how far he got through it, but the first page was just so beautifully flowing and opening up a whole possibility of ideas. I do hope he got more than halfway through all this. Now, Murray Coorey, who's a great friend of Jeremy's and used to live next door, another friendship based largely on music, has very kindly brought along some CDs of his own making, which he says Jeremy inspired him to make. So for those of you who are inclined towards clarinet music, there's some copies here.
There's a pile over there,
Pile
which you
here,
can
so-
have gratis as a memory towards him. And my eulogy never came. But I can remember just a few of the things I wrote in it, though. And we moved into Ballast Point Road in 1978, and not long afterwards there was a move. The people of Borthwicks who were here went, and I remember looking out the balcony and seeing this new family arrive, complete with the dog and the two children. And then, as fate would have it, I found him to be a music nut. He really seemed to me to be obsessed with the whole thing, and I was professionally engaged as a clarinetist at that time. So I remember coming in, and I think it would be quite kind to say the place was chaos. I can remember the chaotic, but we used to spend a lot of good evenings together listening, and sometimes it was very irritating because he thought he knew such a lot about the music, but but the main thing is that we enjoyed it together, and the two. It's been mentioned already. He was a quintessential Englishman. He was a connoisseur of art, yeah, that's for sure. And they say, don't they, that expatriate people are never very happy people. And I often wondered whether the transplanting from England to here was such a good thing. I don't know.
It was always a difficult part of his life, but,
Yes.
but very much a part of his life. And we talked
Yeah.
about the possibility of moving back to England, and he
Yeah.
had so much here. So I mean, what he came to in the end was spending periods of time
Yeah.
there. Like 3 months a year was his ideal, and
Yeah.
that's
And I also said that I mean, we found out pretty quickly that I'm an Anglophile in art and in music. And absolutely. When I was at the Royal College of Music, I met some of the great English composers like Arthur Benjamin and John Ireland and people like that. And it was this, I think, that bonded me to him, because I didn't know many people who had good taste and who
probably still don't. Probably still don't.
No, and I mean, it was a lovely, I think, the more I think about it, it was a lovely, lovely neighbour to have, really lovely, and it went on for such a long time, and through all of the depressions, I tried to be a help where I could. I remember saying to him, you know, for God's sake, let's do something to get you out of this
And he did, as
spiral.
I said,
You know,
he
I
did,
said
he
to him, you know,
did.
you need to sell the house, have a holiday, and get a project going. And of course, he said yes, 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 but he never did anything.
It was a cycle about love
Yes.
loving the house
Yeah,
and
it's
feeling it's
all of
time to
that.
move on.
But
Anyway, speaking of moving on, we better have thank you, Murray. We better have a break. It's getting very hot. And we're going to have a 10-minute break.
Yeah.
Bump the air conditioners through,
Yeah.
and everyone go to the toilet, get a drink, and take some clothes off, and then we'll come back and subject you to more memories.
And the second half is in the nude,
The
right?
second half is clothing optional, definitely.
Turn on the sprinklers.
Yes.
Good
The
idea.
sprinklers will be operating in the back garden. Thank you, Murray.
You all have known Jeremy in the many facets of his personality. I've known him mostly from one facet of his personality, and this little poem, which is a sonnet, which has been written from the heart for him, for Anne, and for Drusilla, narrates a little bit how we got together. Forgive me if I tremble, but I'm a Parkinsonian. The sonnet is titled Ave atque Vale, which is taken from Ovid's A Carmen, where he farewells a dear friend. We met only a few times, yet Jeremy is in the heart a close friend now lost. Anne, the caring Anne, made us meet, mature men linked by an illness of the soul. He said, "Is only this what defines us?" Because his true trait was hugeness of love, enriched by guilt, he also said, "I can't plan for long vacations as I see in diminishing stretches good weather." It truly was a luminous intellect, his own lighting rod, his own shield for his children and for the woman he loved. A towering man longing for infinity, Patrician Jeremy, hail and farewell.
I wasn't going to speak, but I just thought that maybe I should say something about the way that my dad raised us as children, which I think was quite exceptional because, in my view, he had a combination of love, affection, and morality, which we kind of wanted to bask in his love and affection, but in order to do that, we had to sort of concur with his morality. And so he didn't really kind of have to push us or punish us to get us to do what he wanted us to do. Because we were striving to get into his warmth and his glow, we just had to comply with his morality, which then left us with a kind of real sense of, or a real integrity within us that remains after his passing. And that's it.
Now I'm going to share some thoughts about Jeremy, and I'm using a backdrop of images, so if you can get somewhere where you can see photos, that'll help understand what I'm talking about. Now this, I wondered whether or not it was appropriate to show this image. This is how we found Jeremy on the day he died, lying very peacefully in bed in his customary sleeping position with Edward's, yes, and as the doctor said, well, he didn't even know about it, because that's how we remember him sleeping for years and years when we were kids and we'd had a bad dream and we'd go and jump into bed with Dad and be calmed by his rhythmic snoring. This is exactly how he looked. He's still got Edward's baby blanket and his father's watch and the family signet ring. So it's a very sad image, but at least it does show that he had a peaceful end, which is something we can all hope for. So, fairly close to the beginning. It's a bit of a. I'm going to give a little bit of a kind of retrospective of his life, I suppose, and things that have been significant to me about my understanding of his life. When he went to, this is 1959 in Oxford with his great friend Robin. And his time at Oxford was a real awakening for him from the kind of strict, disciplined, post-war British boarding school environment to suddenly intellectual flowering. And he had a great group of friends in England, and a number of them have written memories to us. And I thought I'd just share a few briefly. So this is a bunch of friends that he met in these days. Rod Lyons said, "Jeremy impressed me amazingly when we first met at Magdalen as fellow mod students. He was the nearest I'd ever known to an aesthete. He bought and hung pictures in his college rooms. He loved music and knew a lot about it. He even had a cello sitting in his room. And he was part of what seemed to me an intriguing and self-confident circle, including people like yourself and Robin Butterfield. He smoked a pipe. He was attractive to girls and good at talking to them, something in which I was particularly inept. As the first year progressed, Jeremy befriended me and took my musical education in hand. The way in was through Schubert string quartets, which I still love. Later, when we were both in London, I remember with pleasure going with him to the proms. He was always ahead of me musically, as indeed he was in his general grasp of Western civilization. Having started together at Mods, we both decided to read English rather than greats. In the English group we joined were several people who have remained friends with us for 50 years. And this is a few memories from that group of friends. Also, Nicholas Menon, who was another person from this time who he stayed in contact with. He shared some memories about the trips he'd taken with Jeremy. The first was to Ireland. We left London after going to the opera, Covent Garden's Royal Opera House. Jeremy often went, but I couldn't afford to go very often. We caught the night boat train and had a sleeper. Memorably, we were just changing for bed when the train made an unscheduled stop and were both revealed stark naked to the crowded platform. The early morning ferry was awash with Guinness, for which we quickly found a taste. We hired a car on landing and Jeremy drove us around the beautiful and unspoilt countryside. We went to Blarney Castle where he kissed the Blarney Stone. I couldn't reach it. We both picked up fleas in one of the pubs where we stayed and were scratching for the rest of the holiday. We ended up in Dublin where we went to the theatre and also visited the Guinness Brewery, which offered liberal tastings. The second holiday took us to the Welsh border via a visit to Stratford-on-Avon, where rather hungover from a party in Oxford en route, we saw three Shakespeare plays in the space of 27 hours. That's hardcore. Then we stayed at a farmhouse and explored the Welsh borderlands, and Jeremy fell in love with a retired sheepdog and took it home to his parents at Kinghorn Cottage, but they refused it and his Uncle Cliff took it instead. I think it was called Jem. I can just imagine Jeremy picking up a retired sheepdog on his travels. It doesn't surprise me at all. And his cousin Hazel Nest said that one thing I shall especially miss is his beautifully deep, rich, sonorous speaking voice, still so English and well articulated, which I found so sensuous. Thank you, Jeremy, for being a caring and much-loved cousin. And then Pat Clements, who was a great friend of Virginia and the whole group of friends in one of these lifetimes. I have been remembering his magnificent voice, and the May morning he stood on the stairs to sing Verdi to the breakfast crowd in Cherwell Street, and his semi-outrageous sense of play, as when he left a costume party wearing only a high-style loincloth to go to the local pub for more beer. Always his love of music and always his deep rolling laugh. Which is funny because I asked him if he went to parties when he was young and he said he went to reading parties. He didn't tell me about fancy dress parties with loincloths. So this is a photograph of Jeremy with Edward and I as young boys, and I think you can see the joy that he found in raising us, which was evident, as Edward so aptly put it, in the way he did raise us. I honestly cannot remember a single time in my life, and I think Edward would agree, where he has let either of us down, not been there for us, or just broken a promise, or not been there when you would hope and expect a father to be there. And that was, he was an absolute rock in our worlds, and that's something that a lot of people don't have, and we're both very grateful to have had. He taught us to appreciate seemingly simple things that most adults would, things like sunsets and flowers and things that when you get to a certain age you realise that you've done that as kids and you just gloss past it. Jeremy would remain fascinated with these things and taught us to view them not as a simple wonder, but what he was looking at was the infinite complexity inside these seemingly simple things, the concepts, the structure that were behind them, the history, the connotations, and he had such a rich view of everything from large to small, and such a flexible, beautiful mind like that. Very privileged to have known and to have had as such a big part of our lives. And I believe that this is where his empathy came from. He was an incredibly empathetic person with people, with animals, and I think it was also linked to his his deep understanding, looking below the surface and really engaging with someone's experience and point of view. Even to the extent that when Edward had some friends over many years ago, and they were going to go fishing, and asked Edward if he thought there'd be any worms in the garden that they could use as bait for their fishing trip. Edward said, "Oh, go to the compost bin, there's loads of worms in there." They opened it up, and sure enough, it's a whole bevy of worms squiggling around, so they started gleefully pulling them out. And then Jeremy came out and said, "What are you boys doing in my compost heap?" And he said, "Oh, we're just getting some worms to go fishing." "I think not. You put those worms back. They're perfectly happy where they are, and they're not going on the end of your fishing hooks. You leave my worms alone." He couldn't bear the thought of one of his poor worms trembling as it was lowered into the water to be eaten up by a bream. I remember talking to him about cockroaches and saying, "Dad, you've got to do something about the cockroaches around." He said, "Why, they don't eat much." So he was empathetic in every way, and he lived a very thoughtful life. You can see in this image his really piercing, engaging gaze that spoke so much of how he thought. He questioned everything, not cynically, but truly open-minded, with a curiosity and a love of learning and building a web of understanding and knowing and loving the world, which was something that again, it was such a pleasure and an honour to know. He was very unconventional. One or two people might go so far as to say he was eccentric, and but it was never for the sake of making a statement about himself, but always from an unconscious desire to understand things before he decided on his view and position in relation to it. He wouldn't adopt convention, fashion, ideas, general views without really making a deep analysis and understanding in a very intuitive way, and then deciding where he sat with it and having a quite profound relationship to just about everything that he came across, which is what made him so unusual, but also gave him a great self-consciousness. And when he was talking to someone, he was always more interested in what this person was saying and what he could learn from them and what he could teach them than what they might think of him. And when you're getting so many environments these days, people, their primary concern seems to be the impression they're making and what other people might think of them. That just didn't figure to Jeremy. That was a sideshow. And that made him so charming to people and so engaging. From plumbers to premiers, everyone was charmed and disarmed by his unique presence and his elegant manner. I remember, Edward told me recently when he spoke to someone who he'd worked with, that when he turned up for the interview to get his editing job, he turned up it was hot, so he turned up in a t-shirt and shorts and thongs, and the reception asked if he was there to drop off an application for someone else. He said, "No, I'm here for the interview." And I think it's, after a few words of his rolling, deep, authoritative voice, they were convinced, and they gave him the job of chief editor. But it just shows how convention meant nothing. It was all substance. Jeremy was just 100% substance. Edward and I have spoken recently about how lucky we are to be brought up by both our parents, Virginia and Jeremy, in an environment where we were just as likely to be talking about big ideas and world events and abstract concepts as we were about our homework and our own narrow spheres, and that's really given us given us a great foundation to view the world from, I think. So I truly thank him and our dear mother Virginia for that. And Jeremy was a words man. I believe he was quite proud that he wrote the entry for fuck in the Macquarie English Dictionary, amongst many other things. From my point of view, before there was Google, there was Jeremy. And there was many a casual etymological or historical query between my friends and I was resolved with a late night call to Jeremy. And he'd give us the breakdown of how the word, event or idea had unfolded, much to the amusement of my dear friends. I remember him yelling furiously at John Howard on the television for saying that Australians were disinterested in an issue, because of course disinterested means independent, uninterested means you don't care. He got the two mixed up. And Jeremy was furious, but this wasn't because he was a stickler for the rules. It was because Jeremy appreciated that language is a very limited tool for communicating the depth of human experience, and any degradation of language he saw as a real loss to humanity, and to see the Prime Minister making what he saw as a basic error he found unconscionable. But it's one of the reasons he did say, this is not my time, Oliver. But he was great fun, and he was so adaptable, and his open-mindedness stood him in great stead in any situation. So this is in Papua New Guinea, where Drusilla and he and I, with a couple of other people, travelled in 2003. And Drusilla, would you like to share a couple of memories about that trip and anything else you care to?
Yes, I really would. Although I have to say, listening to you, it keeps reminding me of incidents. So the cockroach, can I tell a cockroach?
Only one though.
One of the first times I had dinner here, Jeremy was cooking. It's always a bit of a kind of laborious process, but he cooked. And Edward wanted some salt. And he came in and he wanted salt out of the cooking salt that was on top of the stove. And Jeremy says, "What do you want the salt from here for, darling? Go with the salt on the table." And Edward says, "There's a dead cockroach in the salt." And I go and look in, and there indeed, on the salt on the table, was a dead cockroach. And I go, "Oh, Jeremy, there is a dead cockroach in the salt." Jeremy takes that and says, "It's only a cockroach, poor cockroach." So, a bit of a miracle really. I came back for another meal. But we had by then bonded over, as everyone else has been talking about the bonding, we bonded over the comma. I remember after a New Year's Eve party at your house, Anne, walking back from East Balmain to here, and we talked about the comma almost the whole way. So that probably sealed our fate. But what I was going to say and wanted to say today was to just remember the really good times Jeremy and I had travelling. He was great to travel with. He was impossible to get onto the plane. The day before, and I put this down to having been sent away to boarding school in England too young, he'd be in a appalling state of anxiety, wouldn't he? Wouldn't want to go, didn't know what to pack. And I'd be on the point of saying, "Well, you don't have to come," feeling like I was this kind of cruel and terrible person. Minute we were out, minute we were in the car, or better still on the plane, and the food was coming towards us, Jeremy would have his table done, the really thing. And when we got to the other end, I'd think, "Oh my God, now what do we do?" And Jeremy would organise everything, find the car, find us somewhere to go. And we went to Europe a lot, to the Pacific several times, and he was always curious and kind of open. And in PNG, that's it. I thought there was going to be a different one of PNG. It's a lovely one. It's
the next one.
It's the next one. He, that's us.
That's all we got.
In Papua New Guinea. It's not always the easiest place to take people, as you can imagine. We were staying in the village. It's pretty rough and ready, but they adored him, and he was really good, and he was kind of interested in everything. And he was, so from travelling in PNG, and I might say the village, he's been twice, you've only been once, there are quite a few little baby Jeremys, some of them are now about 10. Few Drusillas, and the odd
named after him, I hope you mean.
But then when we were in Italy, I remember being in Florence with him, and then he would be up at the crack of dawn and would say it's the best time. We'd be walking all around the city, and he'd come back with the Herald Tribune, and I'd be still lying in. And he'd have found somewhere nice for breakfast, and would have found where all the concerts were on. So that's just a memory I wanted to share of the Jeremy who travelled, and how what a good person he was to travel with.
He sure was. I have very fond memories of travelling to Europe, to Prague with, can I switch? And to Edinburgh with Jeremy, and visiting the flat that him and Virginia lived in Edinburgh, and it was just such a joy. And that we knocked on the door and got ourselves inside and saw the curved windows and the stair with the curved stairwell where he would drop the key down when visitors came, and all sorts of things. And this is in Prague when Jeremy and my dear old friend Michael and his now wife Alison and I were travelling together. And we were three late people in their late 20s, early 30s, and Jeremy in his late 60s, and we were just such a great foursome and had so much fun together. And remember one occasion where there was some interesting building, and there was a what do you call it, the big drop down bar, like the vehicle barrier, and you could kind of squeeze around it. And so Jeremy happily did squeeze around it, and I was about to follow him, and then Michael said, "Wait, do you think we're allowed in there?" And Jeremy said, "Well, we'll soon find out if we're not," and marched on in, and off we went. And that's just so typical of his nature, and what he instilled in Edward and I was, explore first, find out if you're allowed to later. And this was one of our many happy dinners. He did enjoy a quiet beer before lunch, usually in Prague, which was quite acceptable in those circumstances. And one of my greatest memories of having fun with Jeremy is when Edward and I were very young enough that we could both fit in the pantry cupboard on the bottom shelves if we took everything out and curled up and went in there. This is our absolutely favourite game. It would both crawl up and curl up in there, and then he'd shut the doors, and he'd go outside and shut the front door and go out onto the street and wait a couple of minutes, and then he'd come and open the door and march down the hallway saying, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of little boys, where is it?" And we'd start giggling, and then he'd come and start searching around, and then he'd search and open every cupboard in the kitchen, and finally come to opening the pantry, and we were basically wetting ourselves by this stage with gleeful panic. And then he'd go through everything on the shelves and, dried beans, I don't want dried beans. Sugar, I don't want sugar. Then he'd get the mum and say, little boy. And we'd jump out and race around the house. He'd spend the next half hour trying to catch us. And that was just such a lovely, simple game that he invented for us that we haven't played for some time. Now, speaking of his playfulness, this surprised me. This is Jeremy on the toilet. This is I took him to the side of a house we were about to build, which is now finished, and there was this had been a little shed clad with asbestos, and the asbestos had already been stripped off, and there was the old toilet sitting there. So I said, "Hey, Dad, why don't you take your pants down, sit on the toilet, I'll take some photos of you." Just as a joke, he said, "Okay." And so he did. And as a result, we have these wonderful photographs of Jeremy on the toilet in a demolished shed on Longnose Point, which I will treasure forever. So I'm very glad to have been able to share these with you. Maybe we could enter them in some art competition somewhere. And then this, I will end on, is the last photo of Jeremy taken alive, as far as I know. This was in England with our cousin Julian, who was an absolute saint. I believe they're going to be naming a square after him because he took care of Jeremy through a very difficult period, went above and beyond in England, as did a lot of people over there who deserve great gratitude from the family. And this is Jeremy with his two lovely children. Apparently, you can see he was terribly depressed at this time, but he looked so happy, and that ability of children to bring one into the present and make one forget one's troubles, I think it's worked so beautifully with Jeremy, with his empathy. We're very lucky to have that photograph of him happy in his last days. And then finally, I promise this is the last photo. This is a man and his webs. So this is Jeremy in what we still refer to as the playroom. And you can see the spider webs all over the windows. Now most people, when they see a spider web, think, well, automatic reaction, must clean spider web off, pop, gone. Jeremy would think, oh, that's a spider web. What kind of spider's in it? And then you get to know the spider, and I'd be speaking on the phone, what's happening? I'm just watching the spider consume a fly that he's been keeping wrapped for the last couple of days. And he'd comment on this day he was telling me about how he was enjoying watching the light change through the spider's webs on the playroom window, and just love that unique perspective he has on the world.
One under the clock has retreated. Where's that gone? Gone into the base of the clock, I suppose you can't see it.
Can you tell us what's happening?
Well, there was one underneath, the spider underneath the clock, but that one's just retired. And the one at the top is oscillating gently, and the one at the bottom, which is larger, is just swaying to and fro, I think, in response to the motion of the one at the top. And still no sign of the one underneath the clock.
Do we think it's a mating dance or a territorial battle or what?
Yeah, well, we don't know. I mean, without any ground at all except the need for egg bearing, I would have thought that the larger body was a female. And maybe 2 males, maybe 2 children. I don't know what spiders do once they're grown up.
They probably go and get jobs, don't they?
Well, it depends. Some do, some don't. Oh, yes.
And thank you everyone for being a great group of people. And thanks Jessie especially for a magnificent job on helping with the catering, or doing all the catering, and everyone else that has helped us. So thank you everyone.